Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you for listening. I'm John Goodson, a park ranger stationed in Adirondacks of New York. I spent most of my life in Poughkeepsie, a town where the past lingers in old brick buildings and the Hudson River cuts through like an eternal thread. I learned to hunt with my dad in the woods north of town, where every snap of a twig had meaning and the silence of a forest could speak louder than words. Those memories, long weekends tracking deer, sharing coffee from a thermos by the fire, felt distant as I stood in the cold rain that night, the kind that seeps into your bones. It was December, and the usual snowstorm was late this year. Instead, a steady downpour turned the forest into a slick, muddy mess. I was leading a three-man crew on a search and rescue operation after we got a report of two missing hikers near Black Hollow Woods. We'd been at it for 2 days, scouring trails that twisted and disappeared into the vast wilderness. Black Hollow wasn't a place you wanted to get lost in, especially at this time of the year. The hikers had last been seen at a fire lookout point near Maple Creek, so that's where we started. The tower stood tall against the gray sky, but the rain and fog made visibility impossible. Greg, our youngest ranger, climbed up to get a better look while I stayed on the ground with Carla, our medic and all-around logistics expert. "Anything?" I called up, my voice echoed through the woods, coming back hollow. "Just trees," Greg shouted. "And more rain. It's like the whole forest is drowning." We decided to set up a temporary camp to dry off and regroup. There was a patch of flat ground by the creek, sheltered enough by evergreens to keep the rain manageable. We lit the fire, no small feat in this weather, and huddled close. The warmth of the flames was a small comfort, but the unease lingered. Black Hollow had that effect. The air was still. Too still. No birds, no distant rustle of squirrels. Just the occasional groan of a tree bending under its own weight. By the second night, something felt off. Carla had been out marking a trail back to the main road when she came back pale and shaken. "There's something weird out there," she said, her voice low. "I found footprints, big ones, and they're fresh." Greg laughed nervously. "What are you talking about? A bear? Moose?" "Too big for a bear, and they weren't shaped like hooves, more like, I don't know, hands or claws." I exchanged a look with Carla, but we didn't say anything. It wasn't unusual for a ranger's imagination to run wild out here. I figured it was just stress getting to her. That night, while we sat by the fire, the first real sign came. Greg had wandered off to relieve himself and hadn't come back after 10 minutes. I grabbed my flashlight and called out for him. "Greg, you good?" No answer. Carla joined me, and we pushed deeper into the woods, following the trail of muddy footprints. The light from my beam caught something in the distance, a shape, hunched and unmoving. At first I thought it was Greg, but as I stepped closer, the shape moved, slowly, deliberately. It straightened to its full height, towering well over 7 feet. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. The light caught its face, and I froze. Yellow eyes, glowing and intelligent, stared back at me. Its snout was long, lined with jagged teeth that gleamed wet in the rain. "Run," I whispered to Carla, unable to tear my eyes away. She didn't need to be told twice. We bolted back to camp, crashing through the underbrush like frightened deer. Behind us, the thing let out a guttural growl, low and resonant, vibrating through the earth. By the time we reached the fire, Greg was back, pale and shaking. "It followed me," he stammered. "I didn't see it, but I heard it, breathing, close." We packed up camp in record time, adrenaline overriding every rational thought. We knew we couldn't outrun whatever it was, not through the mud and rain. Instead we moved silently, keeping low and sticking to the shadows. The forest seemed alive with tension, every rustle and creak amplified in the quiet. At one point we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a carcass, what was left of a deer. Its chest had been ripped open, ribs splayed like a grotesque display. Deep claw marks scored the ground around it. Greg turned and vomited. We pushed on, every step a battle against the cold and fear. The creature didn't attack outright, but we felt it, watching, stalking. The forest itself seemed to conspire against us, branches reaching out like skeletal hands, mud sucking at our boots. Finally, after what felt like hours, the faint glow of headlights appeared through the trees. We stumbled onto the road, flagging down the first car we saw, a delivery truck heading toward the main ranger station. The driver didn't ask questions, just loaded us into the cab and drove. Back at the station, we filed the report: missing hikers, unidentified animal sighting, area unsafe for further search. Officially we never found them, but Carla, Greg, and I knew the truth. Black Hollow wasn't just a forest, it was a hunting ground, and whatever lived there was still waiting. The Blue Mountains stretched out like a vast ancient fortress, their ridges jagged and dusted with mist even in the summer heat. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and the faint char of old campfires. I've been a ranger here for 7 years, and the wilderness has always felt like home. My name's Henry Wick, born and raised in Billings, Montana. Out there the mountains were colder, their forests thinner. Hiking those trails as a kid taught me the kind of resilience you can't learn in a classroom. But no amount of wilderness experience could have prepared me for what happened last summer. We were a team of 4, myself, Alyssa, who was as sharp with a map as she was with a rifle, Marcus, the newest recruit, with an annoying habit of humming under his breath, and Brian, our grizzled veteran, who'd spent over 2 decades patrolling these trails. Our assignment was routine: check on some old fire lookouts and investigate reports of strange noises near Echo Ridge. The first 2 days were uneventful. We hiked through dense forests, the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shards. Nights were spent around the fire, trading stories and complaints about mosquitoes. Alyssa joked that if she had to swat one more bug, she'd torch the whole forest. On the 3rd day, we reached the old Echo Ridge fire lookout. The tower stood abandoned, its wooden beams weathered and splintered. Climbing it felt like tempting fate, but we had to check its integrity. Marcus volunteered, his humming grating on my nerves as he ascended the rickety ladder. Halfway up, he stopped. "Hey Henry," he called down, his voice tight. "There's something weird up here." "What kind of weird?" I asked, shielding my eyes from the sun. "Just come look." Alyssa and I followed the tower creaking under our weight. At the top, Marcus pointed to the floorboards. They were scored with deep, parallel grooves, claw marks. I crouched down, running my fingers over them. The wood was splintered and fresh. "What the hell made these?" Alyssa muttered. "Bear," Marcus suggested weakly, but even he didn't believe it. The spacing was too wide, too deliberate. We decided to take photos and report it later. That night we camped near a clearing not far from the tower. The forest felt different, too quiet. Even the wind seemed hesitant, barely rustling the leaves. As we sat around the fire, Brian told us about local legends. "People talk about strange things in these woods," he said, his voice low. "Dogmen, skinwalkers, wendigos, take your pick. The Blue Mountains have their fair share of ghost stories." "Yeah, and all of them are bullshit," Alyssa scoffed. "Maybe," Brian said, "but sometimes it's not about believing, it's about not taking chances." Later, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to Brian's stories and tried to sleep. The first encounter happened the next night. We were deep in the woods, following an old trail that hadn't been used in years. Snow from the higher elevations had melted into cold, muddy rivulets, making the path slick. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows. Marcus was the first to notice it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We stopped, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, then faintly, the sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't the rhythmic pant of a deer or the snuffle of a bear. This was deliberate, guttural, and too close. Alyssa raised her rifle, her knuckles white around the grip. Whatever it is, it's not scared of us. Brian motioned for us to back away slowly. As we retreated, a shape emerged from the trees. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, hunched but poised. Its eyes caught the dying light, glowing a sickly yellow. I couldn't make out details, just the impression of fur, claws and teeth. The air grew thick with the stench of wet dog and decay. "Run!" Brian hissed. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. The thing let out a bone-chilling howl, a sound that seemed to reverberate in my chest. It was faster than us, darting between the trees with an unnatural grace. We reached the rocky outcrop and huddled together, our breaths ragged. The creature didn't follow us immediately, but circled, its low growls echoing in the darkness. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whimpered. "Something we don't want to stick around to find out," Alessa said. We decided to stay put until it moved on. The night was agonizingly long. Every rustle, every shadow felt like the precursor to an attack. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely piercing the oppressive darkness. When dawn broke, we made our move. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered, a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. We stuck to the ridgeline, avoiding dense forest. Our plan was to make it back to the trailhead and to our truck. But the creature wasn't done with us. As we neared the clearing where we'd parked its truck, Marcus was last in the line, and the thing lunged from the shadows, dragging him down. His screams were cut short by a sickening crunch. We didn't stop. We couldn't. Alyssa fired a few shots, but they didn't seem to faze it. We sprinted for the truck, the creature close behind. Brian fumbled with the keys, but managed to get the door open just as it closed in. As the truck roared to life, I caught a glimpse of it in the rearview mirror. Its face was a grotesque mix of canine and human features, its eyes burning with an intelligence that felt far too real. We drove straight to the ranger station, our minds racing. Marcus was gone, and the thing was still out there. When we filed the report, we left out the details. Officially, it was a bear attack. But we knew better. Something lives in the Blue Mountains, something that doesn't belong, and it's still prowling. The early spring air in Michigan's Huron-Manistee National Forest carried the unmistakable scent of damp earth and budding leaves. Storm clouds loomed overhead, their dark bellies pregnant with rain, casting a somber pall over the forest. I adjusted my rain jacket as the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches still waiting to bloom fully. "My name's Robert Davidson, and I've been a ranger for 3 years. Back in Los Angeles, where I grew up, the air was dry and the forest sparse, nothing like the sprawling woods of Michigan. I'd left the smog and gridlock behind, but days like this made me miss the California sun. Our task for the day was to inspect a series of trails near Blackwood Hollow, a notorious stretch of forest where hikers had reported strange noises and eerie sensations. Our team consisted of me, Claudia, a no-nonsense ranger who could navigate these trails blindfolded, and Derek, a wary guy with a knack for spotting wildlife before it spotted him. We started out early, the dirt trail slick with mud from a storm the night before. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional call of a distant bird. The trees here were old, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground like veins. Claudia led the way, her machete slicing through stubborn undergrowth. "Let's make this quick," she muttered. "Storm's coming in fast." Derek and I nodded, the weight of the storm pressing down on all of us. My boots squelched with every step as we made our way deeper into the forest. Blackwood Hollow had always been a place of whispered rumors, disappearances, strange sightings, and mutilated wildlife. I'd read up on the area before we set out, poring over old ranger reports and folklore. Tales of the dogman were common here, a half-man, half-wolf creature said to stalk these woods since the 1800s. But I dismissed it as local superstition, the kind of story that kept tourists from wandering too far off the trails. By midday the storm broke, rain hammered down, turning the trail into a muddy river. We took shelter under a massive oak tree, its bare branches doing little to shield us. Claudia lit a small fire, the flames sputtering against the wet air. We sat close, sharing a thermos of coffee as the rain fell in sheets around us. Derek was the first to notice something was off. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I strained my ears but heard only the rain. "Hear what?" "The forest," he said. "It's too quiet." I realized he was right. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to have stilled. The only sound was the relentless patter of rain. A chill crept up my spine, and I glanced around, my hand instinctively resting on the hilt of my knife. "We should move," Claudia said, her voice tense. "The fire won't last long in this rain." We packed up quickly and pressed on, the unease hanging over us like a shroud. As we reached the narrow ravine, the smell hit us, coppery and rancid. It was the unmistakable stench of death. We followed it to the clearing, where we found the remains of a deer. Its body was torn apart, ribs jutting out like broken branches. The ground was slick with blood, and massive claw marks raked across the tree trunks nearby. "What the hell did this?" Derek whispered, his face pale. "Bear," Claudia said, but her voice wavered. "Bears don't kill like this," I said, my stomach churning. The wounds were too clean, too precise. As we stood there, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. My eyes darted to the shadows where the trees seemed to shift and twist. Then we heard it, a low guttural growl, deep and resonant. It came from the tree line where the darkness was thickest. "Go," Claudia hissed, pulling her rifle from her back. "Now!" We turned and ran, the forest closing in around us. The growls grew louder, followed by the crash of something massive moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded as I sprinted, the mud sucking at my boots. Behind me, Derek tripped and fell, landing hard in the muck. "Help him!" Claudia shouted, turning to cover us. I grabbed Derek's arm and hauled him to his feet. The thing was close now. I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight that made my chest tighten. Claudia fired a shot, the crack of the rifle splitting the air. Whatever it was let out an unearthly scream, a mix of animal rage and human agony. We didn't stop running until we reached a small cabin we'd passed earlier. It was abandoned, the windows shattered, but it would have to do. We barricaded the door with old furniture and huddled inside, our breaths ragged. "What was that?" Derek asked, his voice shaking. Claudia didn't answer. She reloaded her rifle with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the door. That night was a blur of terror. The creature stalked us, its growls circling the cabin. At one point it slammed against the door, the wood splintering but holding. I clutched my knife, the blade slick with sweat. When dawn finally broke, the growls ceased. The silence was almost worse. We emerged cautiously, the forest bathed in pale morning light. The ground around the cabin was churned up, massive footprints leading back into the woods. We didn't stop moving until we reached the edge of the forest and the safety of a small village. Derek and I were shaken, but alive. Claudia had a deep gash on her arm from a stray claw, but refused to stop until we were out. Later, as we sat in the village's tiny clinic, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes in the dark. Blackwood Hollow had always been a place of legends, but now I knew the truth. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and it was hunting. The Michigan winter was relentless. The freezing rain had turned the forest into a labyrinth of ice-coated branches, and the snow on the ground, though soft, made every step a test of endurance. My name's Arnold Rambo, and I've been a ranger in the Huron-Manistee National Forest for about 4 years. I came here from Boston looking for solitude, maybe even peace. Back home the winters were just as harsh, but instead of towering trees, it was narrow streets and old brick buildings coated in frost. This week, I'd been tasked with checking on a stretch of trails near Hollow Pine Bluff, a remote area known for its rugged terrain and occasional wildlife sightings. The last storm had knocked down several trees, and I was assigned to assess the damage. I wasn't alone though. My colleague Mark, older, experienced, and a bit of a cynic, was joining me. Together, we'd planned to spend 2 nights in the forest before heading back to the ranger station. The day started uneventfully. We trudged through the icy slush, our boots crunching with every step. Mark was muttering something about how the park service never supplied us with enough gear. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that seemed to swallow sound. Even the usual chatter of birds was absent. As we moved deeper into the forest, I found myself thinking of my family. My mom back in Boston always said that gym was my escape, a place to work out my frustrations. Maybe she was right. Out here the silence and the physical exertion felt similar, grounding, almost meditative. We reached a small clearing by late afternoon. A fallen tree had blocked part of the main trail, so we set up a temporary camp nearby to take a break and plan our next move. The rain started again, a steady drizzle that quickly soaked through our jackets. Mark grumbled as he struggled to light the fire, but eventually he got it going. The warmth was a relief, and for a while we just sat there, letting the heat seep into our frozen fingers. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like some distant animal. "Ever notice how quiet it gets out here?" Mark asked, breaking the silence, like the forest is holding its breath. I nodded, but didn't say anything. The truth was, the quiet had been bothering me all day. It wasn't just the absence of birds or squirrels. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, heavy and suffocating. As dusk settled, we heard the first sign of trouble, a faint, distant sound, like branches snapping underfoot. Mark stiffened, his hand going to the hatchet strapped to his belt. "Deer?" I whispered. He shook his head. "Too heavy." We both stood, our eyes scanning the darkening woods. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just branches breaking, it was deliberate, a slow measured crunch of footsteps in the snow. My stomach nodded as the firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift. Then we saw it, or rather we saw the shape, a hulking silhouette at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It stood unnaturally still, its form indistinct in the gloom. My pulse quickened as I reached for the knife on my belt. "Hey!" Mark shouted, raising his hatchet. "Who's there?" The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My throat went dry as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape was vaguely humanoid. Its proportions were all wrong, too tall, too broad, and its eyes, I swear they glowed, a faint, sickly yellow. Before we could react, it moved, faster than anything that size should have been able to. It darted toward the edge of the firelight, its massive limbs brushing against the low branches. Mark swung his hatchet wildly, but it was gone before he could land a hit. "Into the woods," he barked. "Now!" We grabbed our gear and ran, the fire still burning behind us. The creature didn't give chase immediately, but I could feel its presence, a weight in the air that made my skin crawl. The forest was a maze of shadows and ice, and the rain had turned the ground into a slippery mess. We stumbled over roots and rocks, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Head for the ridge," Mark yelled. "There's a trail down to the village." We didn't stop moving, but the creature was following us, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. At one point I glanced back and caught a glimpse of it, its massive frame weaving through the forest like a predator honing in on its prey. We reached the ridge just as the rain intensified, the downpour masking the sound of our footsteps, but also making it harder to see. My legs burned as we climbed, the cold biting through my soaked clothes. When we finally reached the trail, Mark paused, his face pale. "It's still out there," he said, watching us. I nodded, too winded to speak. The trail was narrow, flanked by steep drops on one side and dense undergrowth on the other. We moved as quickly as we could, our boots slipping on the wet rocks. Then it attacked. The creature lunged from the shadows, slamming into Mark and sending him sprawling. I screamed and swung my knife, the blade connecting with something solid. The thing roared, a sound that was more animal than human, and retreated, its glowing eyes glaring at me from the darkness. Mark groaned, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his jacket, but he was alive. I helped him to his feet, and we stumbled down the trail, the creature still stalking us from the shadows. By the time we reached the village, we were both exhausted and soaked to the bone. The creature didn't follow us into the open, but I could still feel his eyes on me, a lingering weight that refused to lift. Later, as we sat in the warmth of a small tavern, Mark turned to me. "What the hell was that thing?" I didn't have an answer. But deep down I knew Blackwood Hollow had always been a place of legends, and now I was part of one. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.